Good afternoon. My name is Caleb McDaniel, Chair of the Department of History and co-chair of Rice University's Task Force on Slavery, Segregation, and Racial Injustice. I'd like to welcome you to today's event, which is being co-sponsored by the Task Force and by the Department of Anthropology. One major goal of the Task Force on Slavery, Segregation, and Racial Injustice is to develop campus-wide programming to support frank and honest discussion of Rice's entanglement with slavery, segregation, and racial injustice, including through the invitation of speakers to campus to foster dialogue around these issues. Today's lecture by Professor Sean Kelley from the University of Essex advances that goal by helping to foster dialogue and education about the history of slavery in Texas, which provides a crucial context for our work. And you can learn more about our work by visiting our website at taskforce.rice.edu. The lecture is also the concluding event of a symposium held this morning on archaeology, archival research, and public history interpretation, which featured recent student research at Rice on the Varner Hogg and Levi Jordan plantations, two historic sites of enslavement managed by the Texas Historical Commission. This symposium and the excellent student research projects presented were sponsored by the Department of Anthropology and led by Professors Jeff Fleischer and Molly Morgan. And by the way, if there are any students in the audience interested in joining in this important work, you'll want to consider taking the department's fall 2021 course, ANTH 394, The Archaeology of Slavery and the African Diaspora. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to note that we will conclude today's event with a Q&A session moderated by Dr. Faye Yarborough, Associate Professor of History and Associate Dean of Humanities, and the instructor of another fall 2021 course related to our subject, HIST 216, Black Life in the 19th Century United States. To submit a question for the speaker, you can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your window. And now to our speaker. Professor Sean Kelley received his PhD at the University of Texas and is now Professor of History at the University of Essex in the United Kingdom. His historical interests include New World slavery, the transatlantic slave trade, Africans in the Americas, and maritime history, and he is the author of 2 books on these subjects. The most recent, published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2016, is The Voyage of the Slave Ship Hare, A Journey into Captivity from Sierra Leone to South Carolina. His first book, published in 2010 by LSU Press, was Los Brazos de Dios, A Plantation Society in the Texas Borderlands, 1821 to 1865. Today, he will be speaking to us about Isabella's Journey, Texas Plantation Society and the Global Slave System of the 19th Century. Professor Kelley, welcome to Rice virtually, and thank you for sharing your research with us today.
Well, thank you so much, Caleb, for that very kind introduction. And thank you to everybody here today, especially to Molly Morgan. We've been going back and forth on email for a year, I think. And to Caleb for just inviting me to come and talk. Molly and Caleb, over the last really probably about a year, I think, have been filling me in on all of the work that's being done here at Rice. And everything I hear just sounds fantastic. You're so lucky to do this. And I have to say also for me, it's humbling because you've found out so many things that I didn't, I kind of missed when I was doing my work on this all those years ago. And the invitation has also just made me realize, what a strong, department, couple of departments you have there at Rice. I began to kind of realizing just how many people I knew, good friends like Jeff Fleischer and Jim Sidbury, people, Daniel Dominguez and I know each other kind of professionally, and people like Alex Bird, whose work I know very, very well. He probably wouldn't remember, but we met at a conference one time. And I don't know how all of you wound up at Rice in the same place, but believe me, it's to that institution's credit and benefit. Anyway, it's a real pleasure to share some of my work with you. My only regret is I can't be with you in person because I'd really, like to meet everybody. I also really love to eat some Texas food. And I can just tell you the food where I live right now just doesn't compare, but maybe another time. All right, so the subject of my talk today is Texas in the 1830s and 1840s, and I'm going to go ahead and share a PowerPoint. All right, so the subject of my talk is Texas during the 1830s and 1840s, with special reference to Brazoria and Harris counties, places that I think many of you know very well. But I'm going to approach that topic not by recapping the familiar narrative of the expansion of US slavery into Mexican Texas, but by focusing on the journey of one person, a girl or a woman, it's actually uncertain, whom we know only as Isabella or Bella. I first came across Isabella's story when I was researching my dissertation in the mid-1990s. It always intrigued me, but I never really knew what to do with it, probably because most of it unfolded in Louisiana, and I was writing about Texas. So the documents literally sat in my file cabinet for 25 years. A quick word about Isabella. She lost her freedom in Africa, almost certainly in the 1830s. And this is sort of an overview of the whole journey here. And spent the next decade on the move from Africa to Cuba to Brazoria and Harrisburg, Texas, and then finally to Louisiana. It was a journey that deserves to be memorialized, like Alexander von Humboldt's, as one of the great travel narratives of the era. But that didn't happen because it was a particular type of journey. It was a tour of the many regional slaveries that together comprised the global slave system of the 19th century. As someone who repeatedly crossed the boundaries between these systems, Isabella's knowledge of slavery was far deeper than ours could ever be. Though slavery being what it was, she never had the opportunity to articulate that knowledge. But by retracing her journey, by listening to the testimony of those who knew her, and by paying close attention to her actions, we can at least see the outline of these, several worlds that she knew. Although often portrayed as a single integrated system, a world-spanning empire in Sven Beckert's phraseology, the global slavery that Isabella experienced was more akin to a series of imperfectly linked systems. Isabella's odyssey involved moving between these systems, crossing the boundaries between one and the next, finding and exploiting the seams wherever possible. So before moving on with Isabella's story, let me just kind of say a little bit about global slavery in the 19th century, a topic that I'm sure many of you know well. For a long time, historians viewed the 19th century slavery as an institution in decline, as inherently unprofitable or in the process of reaching its, quote, natural limits, destined to be superseded by wage labor and industrialization. For those historians, slavery and modernity were in conflict. And so as a consequence of slavery's backwardness, modernity was destined to prevail. But most historians today see things differently. Slavery, they note, was not in decline at the start of the 19th century, and it was not in conflict with capitalist modernity. In fact, slavery aided capitalist modernity by furnishing key products, cotton for the mills, sugar, coffee, and tobacco for an exhausted industrial labor force. And this one's often forgotten, but palm and peanut oil to lubricate the machinery that literally drove industrialization. Because in many places, and here I'm really thinking mostly about Cuba and Brazil, the enslaved labor force could not sustain itself naturally. The slave system of the 19th century depended on a constant influx of new captives. Though completely illegal by 1830, just a few years before Isabella's journey, the slave trade continued at rates comparable to its 18th century heyday. In the US South, of course, did not rely on the transatlantic slave trade for labor, but Texas planters of the 1830s did, partly because they could, given the contested nature of sovereignty in the region, and partly because it was likely cheaper than buying slaves on the New Orleans market. And if you look at my, it's a graph here, but what you'll see is that the 19th century, it's well almost as high as in the 18th century, but remember that's only 2/3 of the century. So had the transatlantic slave trade continued during the 19th century at that rate, that bar would actually be just about higher. The historians who've studied 19th century slavery have suggested a number of terms and metaphors. Dale Tomick, playing off the notion of a European second serfdom, has termed it a second slavery, based on a global division of labor in which the role of the Americas was to supply raw materials and foodstuffs for the industrializing regions. Sven Beckert, Seth Rockman, Ed Baptist, Walter Johnson, and others have all elaborated on or extended this interpretation. The sum total of these efforts has been an image of slavery as a vast and integrated system, a machine of sorts, channeling labor and capital to suit its needs with a kind of inexorability, and we can only infer efficiency. I don't really have a quarrel with that interpretation, but I am, in David Potter's wonderfully meta formulation, I'm a splitter more than a lumper by temperament. When I look at slavery, whether in the 19th or in earlier centuries, I see not a well-oiled machine, but a kind of a Rube Goldberg contraption. And I'm going to confess to having a special affection for Rube Goldberg, because we actually went to the same high school, though at different times. How to reconcile these two images is a really difficult question. It's one that I spend a lot of time kind of wrestling with. Well, now to Isabella. Everything we know about her comes from two court cases that were filed in Louisiana. The first was Carson versus Dwight, in which a man who purchased Isabella sued to recover a payment from the man who sold him to her on the grounds that she was not legally enslaved. And the second is Isabella versus Picot. This was Isabella's own freedom suit against a third party who claimed to own her. In none of these documents do we ever hear Isabella tell her own story. Instead, her story unfolds from multiple points of view in depositions given by people who knew her, all white, of course, former enslavers, neighbors, and acquaintances over the years. She never argues the case in her own voice, but rather is argued about. In the record, she is an object rather than a subject. Her thoughts are inaccessible to us, and there's much that we will, of course, never know. For example, we don't even know basic facts about Isabella's age or physical appearance. The people who knew her offered wildly differing descriptions. Most opponents in her case agreed that she was between 12 and 14 years old in 1835, which would put her date of birth around 1822. But at least one person who saw her in 1835 put her age at 9 or 10, giving her a birth date of about 1825. While a deponent who knew her in 1836 said that she was 18 to 20 years old, which would give her a birth date of about 1817. I'm inclined to accept the 12 to 14 range, and partly because that's what most deponents said, but also because by 1836, she had a mixed-race daughter. We'll get to that issue in a moment, but it makes the lower age seem less likely, though of course certainly not possible. At the same time, I doubt Isabella was 18 years old in 1836, partly because the deponent's estimate is an outlier, and partly because Erica Melech Delgado's recent work on liberated Africans in Sierra Leone reveals that white officials routinely overestimated children's ages, often classifying them as adolescents and adults, and of course ignoring African understandings of childhood and age grades. Deponents also disagreed about her appearance. Most agreed that she was not tall, but estimates varied from 5'4" to a highly improbable 3'4". So that's a discrepancy of about 2 feet. Some deponents said that Isabella had a speech impediment, a stutter, while others believed her speech was just accented. And at least 2 deponents recalled, when asked, that there was nothing at all notable about her speech. Most interestingly, though, the whites who knew Isabella could not agree on her skin color. Some described her as, quote, very black, or, quote, right dark, while a few deponents said she was, quote, of grif complexion, a French-derived term used in Louisiana to describe people with 3 black grandparents and 1 white grandparent. The descriptions themselves don't really have much bearing on Isabella's story, and it didn't and it doesn't matter if she was tall or short, and it certainly doesn't matter what her speech was like. Even her skin tone wasn't really germane to her case. Her enslavement in Louisiana hinged, as we'll see, on other questions. And anyway, people of all skin tones were held in slavery. What matters more for this discussion are discrepancies, which remind us, of course, of the degree to which slavery and race influenced white perceptions of Africans, to the point that alignment on basic facts like height was impossible. But one thing we do know for sure is that Isabella was born in Africa. Several deponents recalled that she was among the Africans imported by James Fannin from Cuba to his plantation on the San Bernard River in what is now Brazoria County. But the timing of her arrival, which I think is about 1834, makes me wonder a little bit whether she might have actually been among those brought in by Benford Smith, which would put her at Shenango Plantation. We have no additional information on Isabella's life before that point. Crucially, we do not know what part of Africa she came from. And that in turn makes it difficult to say how she lost her freedom. We can construct scenarios, of course, and that's something I've spent a lot of time doing in my recent work on the transatlantic slave trade. I suppose it's just my way of investing the often abstract archival record with some sense of humanity. So indulge me for a moment and let me construct what I think is the most probable scenario for Isabella's origins and initial enslavement. Isabella most likely came from what is now Nigeria. And I say that because a few years ago, Henry Lovejoy and I ran about over 100 names taken from various Texas sources through a database consisting of over 100,000 liberated African names, and found that 60% of the Texas names whose origins could be identified came from ships that sailed from the Bight of Benin, from ports like Lagos, Ouidah, Badagry, and Porto Novo, with Yoruba names far outstripping Hausa, Fulani, and other names from the region. Based on what we found in Texas, then, the odds are that Isabella sailed from the Bight of Benin and was a Yoruba speaker. If that hypothesis is correct, Isabella would have been born into a particularly turbulent era in the region's history. In fact, her probable birth date of 1822 or 1823 was a major turning point in the collapse of the Oyo Empire, which had dominated what is now southwestern Nigeria through the 18th century. And this is an event known as, in some places, the Yoruba Wars. And here I've got two maps up here, one from 1780, one from 1850. And you can see this is sort of the Bight of Benin in the central Sudan. And the circle is kind of basically where Oyo is. And what you can see is, coming into this period, Oyo is a fairly important political entity. And by the end of it, coming out the other end in 1850, you can see the Sokoto Caliphate has really sort of, it's come into existence and it's taken over an awful lot of the region. And Oyo itself has essentially ceased to exist. And that whole process, which took place over a few decades in the early 19th century, that's really probably the background to Isabella's enslavement, if I'm correct about where she is. So the disruption was tremendous. You can't overstate this, as entire towns in the 1820s and the 1830s just ceased to exist while new ones emerged. And whole regions were abandoned while others teemed with refugees. Drought and famine just compounded this misery. So as Oyo collapsed, its constituencies formed ever-shifting alliances and warred against each other, with enslavement and New World exile becoming the fate of many. If we assume that Isabella was enslaved roughly a year before her arrival in Texas, which would put the date at about 1832 or 1833, she would have been among an estimated 13,000 people dispatched into the transatlantic slave trade from the Bight of Benin, most of them to Cuba. It's important to say that the scenario I've constructed for Isabella's enslavement may not be true. The fact is, we don't know where she came from or how she lost her freedom. She may have come from elsewhere in the Bight of Benin hinterland, or she may have come from somewhere else entirely. In fact, we could spin an almost endless variety of scenarios. But regardless of the specific circumstances, I think we can say one thing with reasonable confidence. Isabella lost her freedom because she was seen in context as an outsider. And this is really the most important takeaway. Slavery in Africa, as elsewhere, operated according to certain rules, the most important being ones that governed who was enslavable. Throughout Africa, there was a strong sense that slave status should be restricted to outsiders. Outsider, of course, could be defined in multiple ways, and these vary. Outsiderness could be defined in religious terms, which was of particular importance in the Yoruba Wars. Islamic law forbade the enslavement of Muslims, but permitted it for non-Muslims. Outsiderness could be defined politically, as in warfare. And of course, it could be defined in racial terms, but this was not the case in Africa. Finally, I should also mention that insiders did suffer enslavement, sometimes for the conviction of a crime, sometimes in total violation of the law through abduction or kidnapping. If I were to hazard a guess, though, I would say that Isabella wound up being defined as a political outsider during the final collapse of Oyo. But I'll say it again, we don't know which of these specific definitions of outsiderness applied in Isabella's case. Whatever the circumstances of her enslavement, Isabella crossed the first of several boundaries into a very different form of slavery the moment she left Barracoon and was put aboard a slave ship. The significance of the slave ship was not, and I realize that this runs counter to several prevailing interpretations, but I don't think it was that it can transform captives into commodities, because that had really already happened. Instead, the slave ship linked the very different slaveries of Africa and the Americas. For captives like Isabella, the ship was an introduction to slavery, in which outsiderness was reckoned, not according to politics, as in warfare, or religion, or one's status as a convict or debtor, but rather on the basis of race. And I've spent the past several years collecting narratives of Africans from this era. We have actually over 600 of them now. And one of the things that really comes through in many of them is the rapidity with which people process the difference between slaveries, with particular reference to race. Children, especially, I found, were struck by the whiteness of ships' crews, their first lesson in what was really to follow. And so one final point then about Africa's connection to global slavery, and this is especially the case for the Bight of Benin, is that the religious warfare that engulfed the region was in many ways a response to centuries of Atlantic-oriented slave trading. The leaders of the Sokoto Caliphate expressly barred the enslavement of Muslims and even opposed the sale of non-Muslims to European slavers. Captives were still sold to the coast, of course, but generally against the wishes of the Sokoto leadership. Historian Jennifer Lofkrantz has done excellent work on some of the barriers to slave sales in the Central Sudan, while Paul Lovejoy points out that a far larger number of people remained in slavery in Sokoto than were sold to the coast. All of this goes to my point here, which is that Africa, while obviously playing an important role in 19th century global slavery, was far from perfectly integrated into the system. Enslavement took place partly in response to American demand, and in economic terms, you could say that the supply was elastic. But it was never the case that Africans simply delivered captives on demand to European slavers. Lastly, the slave trade, we should remember, was quite simply illegal. And the British and other nations patrolled the African and American coasts to interdict vessels. Only 1 in 6 ships was taken on average, but this was not a negligible fraction, and it further hampered Africa's full integration into the global slave system. Whether Isabella had some sense of this, we cannot know, but many of the Africans from the region who wound up in Texas surely did. Once in European hands, the shipboard practices marked Isabella's transit into a different race-based system. Much of the violence that occurred aboard slave ships impressed this very point on captives. We could easily spend the rest of the lecture cataloging this violence. I'm just going to mention, to me, what's one of the lesser known and maybe more shocking practices that I've found over the years in more than one source, and that involves the use of dogs to control people aboard ship. You don't hear about that very much. I don't know, that's particularly fearsome to me. And of course, there was sexual violence, which carried much the same message. The fact that Isabella had a mixed-race child raises the possibility that she was raped aboard the vessel that carried her to Cuba. We can't know, of course, and there are obviously many possible explanations for her pregnancy. But that didn't need to happen in order for her to absorb the lessons of the slave ship and to impress upon her that her future in the Americas would be very different from her past. Isabella likely arrived in Cuba in 1833 or 1834, landed somewhere outside of Havana and marched or carried to a nearby location. Although she probably spent relatively little time in Cuba, she surely would have observed that it was in many respects an extension of the ship, particularly in the way that captive status and race were linked. Likely soon she would have been transshipped to Texas. I say soon because there are no reports that I've seen of Spanish being spoken, or indeed any other evidence of a long stay in Cuba among the African-born population of Texas. We may or may not have found evidence one way or the other. In fact, as Greg O'Malley has shown, most people destined for the intercolonial, or I think in this case, maybe we should call it the intra-American slave trade, spent little time in their initial place of landing. Sometime in 1834, 1835, Isabella was placed once more on a ship with 150 or so others and sailed across the Gulf toward northern Mexico. On arrival, Isabella entered the third slave system of her global tour. The Brazoria district of Texas was an unusual one. It was a new slave society. The institution hadn't existed at all there really 15 years earlier. And typically for the second slavery, it's centered on cotton production. Sugar, of course, only came later in the 1840s and 1850s. Sometimes I see that kind of gets a little bit lost in some of this, the writing about Texas. But over those 15 years, slavery had grown very quickly. And there were now approximately 2,000 enslaved people in Texas. Most of them had, in Brazoria County, most of them had arrived from the United States and spoke English, but a larger number were African-born, like Isabella. And in the next year or two, more Africans would arrive in the area, at one point constituting about half of the enslaved population. Texas slavery was anomalous in one other way that would become very significant to Isabella. It was illegal. The issue is a confusing one, since the various decrees issued by the Mexican and Coahuila, Texas authorities were often in conflict. The general pattern was for the central government to attack slavery, while state and local authorities, such as the impresario Stephen F. Austin, tried to nullify the decrees. But the basic picture is clear. The Mexican government essentially abolished slavery in 1829. So while the slavery that Isabella encountered looked very much like that of the neighboring US South, it did not enjoy the sanction of the law. And that troubled some Texas slaveholders. As a general rule, slaveholders did like the law to be on their side. Thinking counterfactually, if Texas had remained part of Mexico, the lack of legal support might eventually have caused slaveholders real problems. But the more immediate problem was the awareness among the enslaved that Mexico did not support slavery, and that this mental association that they developed between Mexico and freedom or non-slavery. Isabella lived in this fast-growing but legally uncertain slave society for about 2 years. Like many of the Africans brought illegally to Texas, Isabella was quickly sold off, initially probably to Brazoria area planter Warren D.C. Hall. Hall was actually one of the more prolific buyers of Africans in the area. We know that he had 17 African-born people on his plantation in 1836, whom he purchased from Ben Fort Smith, the owner of the eventual Shenango plantation. So there is a direct connection here in my ramblings on today, and with some of the work that you're doing here at Rice. So you knew there had to be. Incidentally, you'll notice that I'm pronouncing Shenango with a soft CH. And that's because for 15 years, I lived in New York State, just one county over from Shenango County. And I can assure you that that's the correct pronunciation in New York anyway. One deponent said in the case that Hall had initially purchased Isabella from St. Sinclair or St. Clair Patton, who was actually the brother of Columbus R. Patton, which would link her to the other major project that you're undertaking here at Rice. Be that as it may, in 1833 or 1834, Hall's widowed daughter, Letitia, married a John Gates, and Hall gave Isabella to Letitia as a wedding present. Gates was a blacksmith who initially lived in the town of Harrisburg on Buffalo Bayou, but in 1834, 1835, moved to the Stafford Plantation in modern-day Fort Bend County, with Isabella and her daughters as the only people he held in slavery. The young Isabella, described by most at this point as about 12 to 14 years old, was expected to work as a, quote, servant and, quote, nurse to help Letitia raise the child from her previous marriage. If she did any agricultural work, it was probably more in the nature of food production for the Gates household than plantation agriculture. This is probably a good time to revisit the question of Isabella's own daughter, who, if not conceived earlier aboard a slave ship, was probably conceived in Texas. We can only guess at the circumstances, but obviously our first suspicion would have to be that Gates himself was the father, and given Isabella's very young age, that she did not seek or consent to the relationship. Isabella left Texas very suddenly in March 1836 when Gates and many others panicked at the approach of Santa Anna's army and fled to the US border, the so-called runaway scrape. With Isabella, the Gateses spent the spring of 1836 just across the Sabine River in Louisiana, watching Texian refugees flow into the United States. You have to wonder what Isabella might have made of the experience. This is probably not the first time in her life that she'd fled an oncoming army. But Gates did not tarry long on the Sabine. In the summer of 1836, he moved his family and Isabella to St. Mary Parish, Louisiana. As a blacksmith, he probably targeted the area on the assumption that the local sugar plantations would require his services, and he set up shop on his own. But Gates apparently didn't prosper in Louisiana. The Panic of 1837 had struck, and he went bankrupt, probably because he wasn't able to collect debts owed to him. To satisfy Gates's creditors, the sheriff seized Isabella and sold her to Milton Johnson. Johnson, however, died in 1840. So his widow, Sarah Johnson, on the advice of her husband's executor, John Carson, sold Isabella to William C. Dwight of St. Mary Parish. Dwight offered $700 for Isabella, half in a year with the balance due in one more year. Dwight made the first payment, but before the second came due, he began to fear that Isabella was not legally a slave. After all, if slavery were illegal in Mexico at the time she arrived there, her enslavement in Louisiana would have to be null and void. Dwight demanded that Carson post bond to guarantee Isabella's slave status, which was refused. Dwight's failure to make the second payment prompted Carson to sell Isabella to a Peter P. Coe in 1842. The following year, 1843, Isabella sued for her freedom, citing two justifications. First, since, quote, by the Constitution and laws of Mexico, slavery is not tolerated but prohibited, her enslavement in Texas had not been legal. Second, she argued that even if she were legally enslaved in Texas, then her transportation into the United States during the runaway scrape violated the 1807 Federal Act barring the importation of foreign slaves. She lost her initial suit, with the court finding that she had failed to document that slavery had been actually illegal in Mexico. She appealed the decision to the Louisiana Supreme Court in 1845. The court was clearly hostile to her claim. It not only agreed that she had failed to prove that slavery was illegal in Mexico, but also cited the existence in Texas of, quote, cotton plantations cultivated by slave labor during Isabella's residence there as evidence that slavery was legal. The court also noted, quote, as a matter of public history, that Texas had declared its independence before Isabella crossed the Sabine River. Of course, if that were true, and Texas declared independence on March 2nd, 1836, Isabella, probably crossed, I think she probably crossed a little later that month, does not necessarily mean that she was automatically enslaved, because it wasn't until March 16th that the Texas Convention stipulated that people who, quote, were slaves for life would be, who were slaves for life previous to their immigration to Texas would continue so in Texas. The court was no more sympathetic to her argument that her transportation into the United States violated the 1807 Slave Trade Act. In a strange and irrelevant digression, the court pointed out that under the 1807 Act and an 1818 amendment, states had the right to, quote, dispose of people brought in violation of the law, which in slave states usually meant simply auctioning them off as slaves. But those provisions were repealed in a new act of 1819, under which Isabella should have been liberated, placed into the custody of US Marshals, and resettled in Africa. Bizarrely, yet when you think of it, probably not, the court ruled that Isabella could not sue in state court to have her enslavement voided on the basis of the 1807 Act. She would have to do that in a federal court. The court mocked her argument by asking rhetorically whether the federal statutes of 1807 and 1819 could, quote, affect the rights of the owner of a slave imported under such circumstances, only to answer its own question, we think not. We think not. And with those words, Isabella's journey ends with a sentence to a lifetime of slavery in Louisiana. I haven't been able to find out anything more about her. I spent quite a bit of time searching for Isabella's in Louisiana on Ancestry.com, but found nobody that really, that obviously was a match. Nor was I able to locate an Isabella among the 4,000 or so African-born people listed in the 1870 US Census. And then also because, you know, if you're familiar with Gwen Hall's Louisiana database, because that ends in 1820, I couldn't find her in there, of course. I can only assume that Isabella died, probably in slavery sometime before 1870. That suggests that she died before the age of 50. Of course, there are alternative scenarios, but that would seem the most likely. And I don't know anything at all about her daughter. She would have been about 32 when emancipation came, but without knowing her name, she can't be traced really at all. In fact, the absence of any mention of the daughter in her case really suggests that mother and daughter may well have been separated long beforehand. So what to make of Isabella's journey? Well, I think inevitably there are many possible interpretations. You know, if you were to take these documents, you could do something completely different with them, there's no doubt. But I'm drawn to the motion in her story, to the journey. In the space of about 4 years, Isabella touched on at least 2 and probably 3 of the 19th century's major slave societies, Cuba, the United States, and probably West Africa, though the nature of slavery there in the 1820s and 30s varied a great deal depending on location, and we aren't even sure that Isabella came from there. If that's correct, though, the only one that she missed was Brazil. So we might say that her tour highlights the high level of integration that characterized 19th century slavery, the networks and connections that funneled so many Africans to the coffee, sugar, and cotton plantations of the Americas, though of course Isabella seems not to have actually worked on any of those. And that's correct. But I'm equally, if not more, struck by an idea that exists in tension with that one. And I'm speaking here of the seams between these slave societies, between systems that reckon outsiderness according to religion and politics as opposed to race, for example. The documentary record that we rely on to understand global slavery doesn't always highlight that kind of thing, although we can be sure that the people like Isabella who crossed the boundary from one to another took careful note. What I like about Isabella's story, however, is that it provides us with at least one very concrete example, not just of boundary crossing, but of the strategizing that I've always seen as inevitable in the 19th century world of bordered slavery, and in particular of Texas slavery. Her freedom suit against Picot shows not merely an awareness, but an astuteness. We don't know whose idea it was to point out the different status of slavery in Mexico versus the United States, or when Isabella became aware that the seams in global slavery could be used to contest her own enslavement, but she figured it out. That it took an utterly illogical and self-contradictory court decision to defeat her bid suggests simultaneously, I think, both the strength of the global slave system of the 19th century and its vulnerability.
Thank you so much. So I want to remind the audience that if you have questions, you're free to ask them in the Q&A, and I'll try to moderate that for you and ask them to Professor Kelley. But as usual, for anyone who's been involved in Q&A with me, I like to take the liberty of asking the first question. And to be honest, I might have to take the liberty of asking more than the first question because you've just presented us with so much wonderful information in Isabella's story. So I want to go back to a comment that you made, and I don't know if I'm getting the number right, but you said something like half of the slaves in the area were African born.
Yeah, that's an estimate that I have.
Estimate, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's very slippery, so you have to kind of take that for what it is. If memory serves, that I think what I did is so the earliest kind of reliable estimate we have for the eventual Brazoria County comes from, I think, the tax rolls of 1837, which, if I'm remembering all this correctly, gave a number of about 2,000. Mm-hmm. I've kind of settled in my own mind on an estimate of give or take 1,000 Africans. So those are the two numbers that I'm working with there. What I do think is the case, I mean, regardless of what the precise, proportion there is that Brazoria County, it's the first real serious plantation region of Texas. It's really a couple of decades ahead of most of the other areas, and that they, very early on, basically turned to, the African slave trade by way of Cuba in order to get labor for themselves. And so those circumstances at the very early, moments of sort of Texas plantation slavery, just the circumstances were such that those planters, that's where they turned. And it wound up being at least a very sizable, if it's not 50%, it's a significant proportion.
Well, so what follows from that in my mind is, do you see any particularities or cultural retentions that are stronger there than we might find elsewhere in the South, because there is a more direct connection between the enslaved population and an African experience? So I'm very curious if you see any evidence of that. I mean, your naming practices hints at that, right? That if those names are holding over, but I just wonder if there are other things that you see as connected to that more direct link to Africa for those enslaved people.
I have spent a very long time, or I did spend a very long time kind of trying to answer that question. And it's a very difficult question to answer. Those of you who've worked in this will surely be able to attest to that. I was never, I was always looking for things, but I'll name a few things. I mean, it's very hard for me, and of course we have archaeologists here who may have some other ways of approaching this, but I couldn't really. I spent quite a lot of time trying to find those kinds of things. Here's what I think I did take away, and these are kind of shadows. These are kinds of things that you often kind of glimpse when you're working in this field, but it's so hard to grab onto anything. One is that there does seem to be an awareness of Africa and African background, and a background that's very, very close. So if you look at some of the WPA narratives, if my memory serves, I think 4 of the Brazoria County narratives reference, none of them are by African-born people, but those 4 reference Africans being there. And that to me is significant, and that to me is probably something you're not going to see almost anywhere else. But maybe more tangibly than that, what I noticed was a certain tendency toward marital endogamy, where to the extent I was able to kind of put these things together, it appears to me that African-born people in Texas preferred, where possible, to marry African-born people, to find African-born partners. And you can see it's interesting because the sex ratio appears to have been kind of characteristically unbalanced. So what you get is almost all African-born women are in relationships, partnerships, marriages with African-born men. And that to me says something significant. It's not the same for African-born men, but of course that's because they outnumber the women by so much. And I saw, so many of them marry, Creole women or American-born women, but there's also, I found evidence that was on the Mims plantation of this sort of group of African-born, as near as I could tell, bachelors, people who never seem to have married. And you can only, again, I love concocting scenarios, so I've spent a lot of time doing that. But that's, to me, those are the real tangible. That's probably the most tangible manifestation I've found. But I think obviously we have other people who've been looking at this. They might have more information.
Okay. So I'm going to hold on to a couple of my questions because we have a couple in the Q&A. So John Buffington asks how a slave could afford the cost of her suit. So how is Isabella able to pay for this suit against Cuba? And wonders if there's the intervention of an abolitionist. Do you have suspicions about that or information? Again, because you do point out the complexity of her suit, and how is she coming up with these, very complex legal arguments?
Yeah, and I wonder about that. I don't know the answer to that. Of course, you're right. People would need to to do that, and I think very often it came in the form of, I mean, one or the other. If you had a free family member who could, finance this kind of thing, then obviously that would be one way to do it. If not, you might be looking at a white patron, to help you in this. In Isabella's case, there is one kind of thing that catches my eye, and that is the involvement of, if you remember in the story, I know it gets a bit complicated, but there was a man who had bought Isabella and then got kind of worried that she wasn't legally enslaved, and so he kind of pulls back. Well, that same person, William Dwight, does seem perhaps to be involved with the freedom suit that she files a little bit later, and that, of course, would raise some suspicion. I've often wondered if there were some kind of relationship, however that might work. But the real answer to the question is I don't have that information. But again, I love spinning these scenarios, and that would be that's one of them.
All right, Jim Sidbury has more along the lines of that freedom suit, more questions along those lines. He points out that he knows a lot more about freedom suits in Republican Virginia. And so he's asking from that context these questions, right? Do you know much about the lawyer who took her case and why he got involved? And if there's more information about why there isn't testimony from her, because the suits he knows about include elaborate depositions from the plaintiff in the suits. But here it sounds like there isn't that happening. And I was thinking of the same thing in my own mind. I was thinking about Celia, a slave.
Yes, of course. Yes.
Right. And you get the testimony of other people questioning her, and then those white people providing the testimony in court. So just more on the suit. Yes.
Well, first off, hi, Jim. But second, I really don't have the answer to that, unfortunately. I've wondered about it, and I don't. To be honest with you, what I've got here is some great documents that I've had in a file drawer for 25 years. So I haven't really had the chance, and I would invite anybody. If I don't claim proprietorship over this material, and you're very welcome to try to hunt this down. But like you, Jim, I was kind of, I guess, mildly surprised at the absence of an actual. I mean, there is a petition that was placed before the court. So clearly, that happens, and to that extent, that's the closest we get to Isabella speaking. But it's a very legalistic, petition. It speaks to points of law with some sketchy biographical background. And so I'm sorry to say I just actually don't have more on that. But again, I invite anybody to pick it up and look into it.
Well, related to sources that you do have, this is me asking a question. You said you found about 600 narratives.
Yes.
So I would like you to talk more about that. I'm just imagining classroom use of these narratives, right?
Yeah.
So can you tell us more about these narratives and
gladly. There's a question I can answer. There's one I can answer. So I've been involved for the past several years. It's not 10 years, but it's 8 years with a project. It's with a lot of people, with Paul Lovejoy and Jane Landers. And what we've been doing is we've been collecting biographical information on Africans, but my special niche in the whole project has been to focus on autobiographical testimony. And there is this kind of bit of conventional wisdom that says that this is extremely rare, and it is if by autobiographical testimony you're thinking of great big, what I call the canonical narratives like Gustavus Vassa and people like that. But if you're a little more flexible with your definition, and you start to focus on sort of often narratives that are embedded in other types of sources. the amount of testimony actually grows. And so over the years, as I said, we've been pulling these things out of all kinds of documents. You're thinking of missionary records and travel records and things. And it might be, sometimes it's literally just a few sentences, sometimes it's a few pages. But this is, I think it really, I like to think it's kind of moving us past some of the tendency to simply fill those evidentiary gaps with, speculation and intuition. I recently did an article on enslavement and sort of modes of paths to enslavement that was based not on the kind of general typologies that you usually see of, warfare and kidnapping and things like that, but actually on 100 testimonies from one part of Africa. So, because oftentimes the only person who really knows how anybody was enslaved is the person themselves. So yes, we have quite a lot of that. And that's where I get this, I should say, by the way, that one of the things that you don't see a whole lot of in these testimonies is discussion of slave ships in the Middle Passage. And that tends to be a subject that gets, you can sometimes actually, people will almost explicitly say, I don't really want to talk about this, which says a lot in itself. But to the extent, but a number of people do. And that's where I was sort of getting this, you see people processing the whole sociology of a slave ship. And it's very, very interesting, with race being obviously a very important part of it, but other things as well.
Okay. A question that connects to this idea about the moment of enslavement and the person experiencing it would be able to say more. Joseph S. asks about the Sokoto Caliphate, and that you mentioned that they resisted the European slave trade. And he asks, what were the groups in West Africa that would have cooperated with Europeans in the selling of people?
Good, it's a really good question. And it gets obviously into some very complicated issues with regional history. But I think it's pretty clear that the Sokoto Caliphate is, it's in part, the jihad that created it was in part a response to the slave trade and this sense that, something was wrong. And especially, the Mohammed Bello and Usman Danfodio, so the originators of the caliphate, were especially focused on the enslavement of Muslims. And they didn't have a problem per se with the enslavement of non-Muslims, because there were lots of eventually plantations and the like in Sokoto. But they did tend to oppose the sale of any captive to Christians, because one of the justifications for slavery in Islamic law was this idea that captivity should be a route to bring people to the faith. And of course, if you're selling them off to Christians, you're violating that idea. Now that's not as deeply held a belief as this idea that Muslims should not be enslaved, but it is there, and there are all kinds of very interesting restrictions. So the second part of the question then is, well, okay, if that's the case, then how are people winding up in slavery? And I think the real answer to that is that in the sort of southern areas, which technically weren't part of Sokoto, but which are the old constituencies of Oyo that have been utterly destabilized by the sort of the larger conflict. These are non-Muslim areas for the most part, and as that the Oyo fragmented, a lot of those groups there would finance their weapon buying and all that kind of thing through the sale of the captives that they took. And because many of these areas weren't Muslim, not yet, they didn't have the same inhibition about doing that. But I think one of the things that Lovejoy's kind of been arguing in recent years is that the potential for this region would have been to supply many, many more captives for the transatlantic slave trade than it actually did. A lot of people are losing their freedom, but relatively smaller number of them are going into the Atlantic trade. So it's a very complicated issue.
So here we have a question from Cody Mobley. That's about resources for people who are trying to trace their own ancestry. And if you have any suggestions about people who know their ancestors have been in Louisiana and Texas in the 1820s and 1830s, where would you point them to look for that kinds of information?
Okay, well, I know less about Louisiana, but one resource there that I will just mention is Gwendolyn Midlow Hall's Louisiana. I think what it was called the Louisiana, might be called the Louisiana Slave Database or Slavery Database. If you Google Gwendolyn Midlow Hall and Louisiana database, it'll come up. And yes, and it's slave.org. Yes, it's under that umbrella as well. So that would be my first port of call for anything having to do with Louisiana. And Louisiana, of course, I mean, there's going to be much more, and I don't know it as well. For Texas, what I would kind of suggest, I think probably the most fruitful place to look would be in things like probate inventories, and the like, deeds also, deed records. I found, when I was kind of searching for Africans in Brazoria, and that I mentioned I got a list of well over 100. Almost all of those came from either probate records or deed records. Don't forget also that the census of 1870, as flawed as it is, obviously that's the first place where you're going to find people named. And so don't overlook that. And there are Africans in that census. I don't know if you're the person asking the question specifically thinking about African ancestors from, say, Brazoria County or not. But obviously that's a very good place to go. So again, deed records, probate inventories for the area, I think, are probably first place to look.
Okay, we have a question from Professor McDaniel, who has us circling back to these suits. And he points out that the suit came before the Supreme Court of Louisiana while the United States was at war with Mexico and began in the immediate aftermath of Texas's annexation as a state. Did these political contexts shape the arguments or outcome in the case at all?
Well, that's interesting. Honestly, Caleb, that got straight by me. I didn't even make that connection. And I think that's maybe the reason is that it didn't come up at all. The issue, before the court was really not, and also remember that Isabella left, Texas in 1836. So she's not even there, really during the Republic period and the lead up to annexation. But it didn't come in at all. The real issue that was being litigated there was this question of whether slavery, did or did not legally exist in Mexico. In fact, they didn't even really make much of Texas. I mean, Texas was, they're treating as part of Mexico, as for the purposes of the suit. And the court seems to have taken that seriously enough, because there was this, I didn't get too much into the details of it, but there was an interesting sort of little charade that went on. Again, you can tell I don't think the court was really hearing this in good faith, but there was this thing that happened where in her first suit before the lower court, where the court said, she said, I can prove that slavery was illegal in Mexico at the time, that I lived there. And the court kind of said, okay, prove it. And so she actually wound up getting a continuance to go and find proof, which she was never able to do. And then there's a whole thing, and you'll see, by the way, if you follow this case a little bit through the years as it gets kind of cited and case law and the like, what you're going to find out is that the big issue that that this case was about, as far as later generations were concerned, is this question of different foreign jurisdictions and the application of the law. That's what the whole case kind of revolved around. And they, as I said, there was relatively little mention of, no mention of annexation or anything like that. They're focused clearly on the period 1836 and earlier. So, but it's an interesting thing to think about, and whether, I'll tell you, by the way, I should also mention that you'll know the name of one of the judges in this case. It was John Slidell. And so, maybe, who knows, in the Slidell papers or something like that, we might be able to pull something out. But we also know what kind of a guy Slidell was anyway. So.
So another question that one of the attendees has is, what do you wish you knew more about Isabella's story, right? Is there something about her life story that bothers you the most? If you could magically come upon a cache of records, right?
Yeah.
What question do you want answered?
Well, given where my work is these days, I would love to know more about her life in Africa and the circumstances of her enslavement. If that big question mark, I would love to even know where she actually came from. The big question mark on the one of the slides that I had, that's the question mark that I would really like to know about, because to me, I mean, that's sort of the thrust of a lot of the work that I'm doing now. That, to me, that's absolutely fascinating. But there are many other things that are probably more recoverable than that, having to do with, one other thing that I would do. I don't even live in the United States anymore, so it's a little difficult. But it would be to see if she ever tried to file suit in federal court under the 1819 Slave Trade Act, because if you remember from the talk, the state court said, no, that we don't deal with that at all. As far as you were concerned, you have to stay in slavery. And my guess is that probably that's where it all ends. But it would be kind of interesting, if you want to go to the National Archives and the district court files for New Orleans, to see if anything ever got there on this. Because as far as I'm concerned, she was legally right. And there's no way that she should have been enslaved, in Louisiana. This takes us back to that question we had about, was anybody helping her with this legal activity? I don't know, but if anybody is curious, I'd love you to find out and tell me the answer, because I don't know when I'm getting there.
I want to sneak in one last question before we let you go. And this has to do with a comment that you made, that importing slaves is cheaper for these Texans than buying them in New Orleans, which surprised me, that it would be cheaper to import them from afar. So I just wanted you to talk a little bit more about what the market for enslaved people was like for these Texans in Brazoria County, and the kinds of decisions that they might have been facing as they try to figure out the labor for these plantations.
Yeah, and this will be a data-free, answer to your question. So it's a little bit impressionistic, but I always wondered about that. I mean, this seems like a bit of a length to go to in order to do something that everybody was doing. It should be pretty easy to do if you have the money. A lot of people are, and I think the answer to that is that two things. That, remember, a lot of this activity is happening in 1834, 35, and 36. And a lot of you probably realize that's really the crest of the kind of, the so-called flush times in the old Southwest. Cotton prices are high. Planters are buying enslaved labor. Especially in places like Louisiana, and so the prices are for the price of a slave is going to be fairly high at exactly the moment that these Brazoria, area planters are trying to get a labor force. And so it's always been one of my hypotheses, for why that was the case. And then it seems, as near as I've been able to calculate, I'm sorry, I don't have the numbers here in front of me, that it actually was less expensive to purchase a captive in Cuba at the time. I mean, I've compared the prices before, and it really was cheaper. Now, of course, there would be other expenses that would add to that. But that's always been my, my suspicion. And remember, I'll give you one last thing is, I think a lot of these Texas planters are, well, let's just say they don't have really good credit back in the United States. And, a lot of them ran to Texas because they're running away from debts. And that means that probably it was hard for a lot of them to really go into, say, New Orleans and compete with the Mississippi planters and all the like for slave laborers. So I've always, that's always been kind of my explanation for why that's the case. I don't know. Maybe other people have found other things.
I just find it interesting because in my own work, I look at the Choctaw Nation and the Cherokee Nation, and in my records, they go to Louisiana to purchase slaves, right? And so it's when you say, oh, it's cheaper to Cuba, I am kind of surprised that some of the people I study aren't also looking to Cuba to purchase enslaved people, because that would have been just as readily, in terms of distance and all of that, they could have done the same thing. So that's what made me think about that question.
Yeah. Although I would have to wonder, then you'd have to transport them inland, a long way, which would be not easy, I would think. At least Texas has got a coast, and they're mostly staying pretty close to the coast. That's the other thing I've kind of determined with this. I mean, Brazoria just becomes far and away the center of this kind of activity. So, yeah, interesting though. Very.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Kelley. Thank you to the audience for sharing some time with us today. We really appreciate you joining us and for these thoughtful questions for Professor Kelley. I don't know if Dr. McDaniel wants to close us out with anything before we let everyone go.
Thanks so much, Professor Yarbrough, and thank you, Professor Kelley, for sharing your research with us today. We greatly appreciate it. And I want to remind our audience to visit taskforce.rice.edu, where you can learn more about our work. And interestingly, if you followed the references to the Shenango plantation, the first episode of the Task Force's Doc Talks podcast discusses a document connected to that plantation that also connects the story to that of William Marsh Rice. So I appreciate your attendance, and thank you again, Professor Kelley, for spending time with us today.
Thank you again, everybody. It was a pleasure.